Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you all for coming. Just picking up on Stefan's last point about how music expresses who we are and who we wish to be, that's kind of central to this idea of identity improvisation that I'm going to be talking about, because I'll be focusing on how identities can change over time and how we may be able to become who we wish to be, but how also structures can impede that process. I'll start out by giving you my first impressions of the poster for today's talk, which Melissa did a fabulous job on. When I first looked at it, I thought that image in the background was a flag, because I was thinking identity, flag, nationalism, because I'm a political scientist. When I looked closer, I saw that it was a fingerprint. And I think this idea of flag versus fingerprint gets at different conceptions of identity that we may have. So we may think of identity as something unique to us as an individual person, something that's pretty unchanging, innate, natural, like our fingerprints. On the other hand, we might look at identity as something that's characteristic of groups, that's formed through interaction, that may change over time, such as a nation conceiving of a flag. The flag has some staying power, but it can be tinkered with. You can add a star here or there, or there may be new flags developed as new nation states emerge. So both of these are entirely valid ideas of identity, but the one I'll be focusing on today is the one most of interest to me, and that is group identities and also how they are formed and change over time. A phrase that I like is identity improvisation. So I gave that as the title for my talk. I think it captures the idea that identity can change, but also that we have to deal with some basic structures. So like a jazz singer or like a dhol player, you can kind of tinker with and come up with rhythms. But obviously, Stefan and Jordan had some kind of structure because they stopped at the same time. And it might not be obvious to us, but there was some underlying structure to the rhythm that they had to follow, that they couldn't just completely have a free-for-all. And so like that, when we perform, as Stefan said, or make decisions about what identity to highlight in a given situation or at a given point in our lives, we have some freedom, some degree of choice, but there's also some structures that may limit us. These might be social structures, family pressures, economic limitations, even political structures. What identities do governments recognize? What boxes can you check off in the census? So there's always some kind of structure, and even the most gifted vocal improviser might have a run-in with the state at some point in his life that would structure his degree of freedom. I can't help myself. When I give a lecture, I have to have a recommended reading list. I couldn't require it ahead of time, but I'd invite you to turn to some of these thinkers if you're interested in ideas of identity change and also the limits to identity change, because there's people all over in many different fields working on this. One classic iteration of this is Pierre Bourdieu, coming from a background in philosophy, also working in sociology and anthropology. Major social theorist. He came up with the idea of regulated improvisation. And as another musical metaphor, he talks about how our lives may be orchestrated, but there's no apparent conductor. So he looks at how social structures can impede our behaviors, shape our behaviors, regulate us, even homogenize us to some extent. Kimberly Crenshaw is also very influential in terms of identity and identity theorizing in the field of law and critical racial theory and feminist theory. She looks at the ways our various group identities intersect. In particular, in her work, she focuses on race and gender, and more particularly racism and sexism, and how when identities intersect and overlap in the lives of individuals, that it can have its own dynamic, that you have to look at the interactions between these two identities. And if you're going to confront racism and sexism, you have to look at the dynamics between those when you're coming up with laws or political strategies to fight back. James Scott is a political scientist and an anthropologist who looks at the way power structures can impede subordinate groups, but also, perhaps most importantly, has always looked at forms of resistance, even among subordinate groups. And his most recent work, The Art of Not Being Governed, is a great title that captures his work on groups that live in the Himalayas, some of them actually, that have always tried to evade state structures and sort of determine their own identities. So when governments said, you will be lowlanders, you will become farmers, you should be a subject to our state or our government, they managed to evade this for years and years and years. And so it looks at how people can, even in subordinate positions, somehow determine their own identities in many situations. And finally, from literary theory, Stefan Greenblatt has edited a book. It's really a manifesto, which is an exciting name for an edited volume. It's called Cultural Mobility. And he looks at, and the authors in this work look at the way cultures change and interact through processes like even human mobility, like colonizers coming into contact with the colonized, or tourists traveling in other parts of the world, and how migration can affect cultures and identity. It's in the case of the drummer moving to Delhi and trying to make a go of it as a more pop artist. So these kinds of cultural mobility and human mobility can have an impact on, obviously, identity mobility as well. So Stefan has already put up a thought piece where he put up all his identities. So you're probably already thinking about the many, many identities you have. I've just listed a few: class, race, gender, age, religion, nation, but there's many, many more that you might think of related to your professional life, shared interests with other people, etc. So you've got these ideas maybe in your head, which identities are important in your life. I'd also like you to think about which have changed over time in your life and which are the hardest to change. And we can't necessarily generalize that certain types of identity are going to be easier to change than others. One person might find it easy to change a religion. We simply convert. But in another setting, social, legal setting perhaps, that might be one of the most difficult changes to make. So even in this room, probably, you could rank these in terms of their changeability quite differently depending on your own personal situation. Another thing to think about is which identities in your life you would like to cherish, to treasure, to keep just as they are, and which are things you would rather tinker with and change. And this brings in issues of power and identity. So in many cases, identity is used to make hierarchies. And if an identity is keeping you in a subordinate position in a society, you might want to change that, or at least challenge it, reformulate it. If an identity is giving you a position of power, you might be perfectly happy leaving it the way it is. Just this weekend, I was at a workshop at the University of Michigan and got to talk to a professor of psychology up there, Ram Mahalingam, and he's doing really interesting work on caste in India, and also more generally on these issues of subordination, domination, and identity. And he pointed out that in psychology, research has shown that if you're in a subordinate position, your view of identity tends to be more that it is changeable, that it's not given, that it's not natural, that it's determined by social structure. If you're in an identity that's kind of at the top of the heap, your view of that identity is that it's natural, it's fixed, it'll never change, and of course it won't. This isn't true in every case, but that's a general psychological pattern. But at the same time, it's often the people in the subordinate positions that In their minds, they know that identity is not fixed and it should be changeable, but may not have the resources to actually press for change. What I'll be looking at next is an identity that is maybe an extreme case of difficulty in maneuvering. It's the caste system in India. And it bears some resemblance to a lot of other forms of domination around the world. I've done comparative work with race in the United States and South Africa as well. So it's not completely fixed, but it is an extreme case in which structure may really be hard to maneuver out of, particularly if you're in the lower caste ranks. At the same time, like I said, you may not have the resources if you're in a low caste to really pose much of a challenge. But there's a couple strategies of identity improvisation that I'd like to highlight that allow even the lowest castes, the ones that historically were considered untouchable, to maneuver up the system. I'll focus in on two strategies and then look at some examples of these strategies in practice and then also some of the backlash against them. So the first one is to take the category of caste but flip it, repurpose it to use for a progressive end through policies of affirmative action, which in India were in place decades before they were put in place here. The second strategy is not to use that category, but try to explode it, to subvert it, to challenge it. And this, I argue, many people are doing through religious conversion, by evading caste, by converting out of Hinduism. Both strategies were championed by a leader of many low-caste movements and initiatives, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who championed both these strategies. And incidentally studied in the United States for a time at Columbia University prior to returning to India and helping set up the legal system and the 1950 Constitution. Both modes of improvisation I talk about here, affirmative action and conversion, have faced quite substantial backlash. So any effort to improvise, particularly if you're from a less powerful group, is often fraught with peril. So first strategy, repurposing caste for affirmative action. This includes reserve seats in government jobs, some admissions to university, quotas, as well as reserve seats in legislatures, including the parliament, for low caste groups, some tribal groups, and some other groups. And so here, identity has shifted in a couple interesting ways. One is a new label has come onto the scene. Rather than untouchable, the lowest castes are categorized as scheduled caste or scheduled castes, which is an administrative term. They make lists or schedules of everyone who can benefit from these policies. So the term becomes an administrative category. Also, you have a real shift from some of the lower status occupations, including, like in some cases, the musicians, but also things like cleaning the streets with brooms, and to professional jobs, administrative jobs, and even the parliament. So the protests against this often are dramatic portrayals of how unacceptable this flipping of identities is. And here we have medical students protesting against affirmative action, and these are presumably upper caste medical students in medical school with their white jackets, and they came out in quite a few high numbers and were sweeping the streets to say, well, if the untouchables come into medical school, we, the people who should be in medical school, are going to be out sweeping the streets. The second strategy is conversion. Here you're not using that caste category like you would in affirmative action, but trying to subvert it, undermine it, complicate it. And so there was a mass conversion to Buddhism in the western state of Maharashtra, and a number of other states had smaller scale conversions. But in 1956, hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously converted to Buddhism from low castes. And I had the opportunity to meet many of them and talk about their memories when I went for the 50th anniversary of this conversion. You could see that this is a point of pride, not just a political maneuver, but a community building maneuver. They had parades, they had flags, which political scientists always love, and there was also women involved. This was a form of activism that women were completely involved in. It wasn't like a violent protest, it was Buddhism. With this strategy, you had a further shift. So you didn't just have an administrative category, the scheduled castes anymore. You had a new political category as well as a religious category. So the scheduled castes embraced, many of them, a new term after this conversion in subsequent years called Dalit, which translates as crushed or oppressed. So it's a much more in-your-face revolutionary term. And in fact, there was a Dalit Panther movement in the 70s explicitly modeled on the Black Panther movement in the United States. Other Buddhists said, don't even call me Dalit or Dalit Buddhist, and corrected me when I accidentally called them that. Said, just call me Buddhist. And so this is saying we're no longer in the caste system and we're a part of a broader Buddhist community. And in fact, at the commemoration, you had Buddhists, monks from all over India, but also other countries, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, even Japan that had come. So they considered themselves part of this other broader identity. And they also played music through that big loudspeaker, but now I should have taken notes on that, I'm realizing. So finally, you did have this move to Dalits, Dalit Panthers, even the category of Buddhist, but there was still some limits, and to this day, many people in India, just socially, and even the government, calls these Buddhists neo-Buddhists. So they're like newcomers, and they have a distinct label from other Buddhists that keeps that caste background in the back of people's minds. Finally, there's been all sorts of forms of backlash against lower castes that have transcended their typical walks of life, but I'm just showing you one example of a lot of identity improvisation going on at a shrine that's used by both Hindus and Buddhists. And they've put a lot of different figures in a lot of different colors, including a Hindu god, Dr. Ambedkar, who I spoke about, and Buddha. And it's sort of all these competing images about who should have this space. And there's even some orange paint placed on the Buddha up in the corner to try to reclaim even Buddha himself as part of Hinduism. So not only are they sometimes trying to reclaim the Buddhist converts, but even Buddhism itself as part of a broader Hinduism. So final questions. So this improvisation is kind of subversive, it complicates caste, but at the same time, even these converts are jumping from one group to another, from one religious category to another religious category. And so it's not completely subverting groupism. So like in Professor Williams' autobiography, he's talking about trying to maneuver on the color line and trying to live his life on the color line. And so there's a lot of people that are in between categories, living in geographic borderlands or in between categories because of migration, marriage, etc., even political awakening. And so even this form of improvisation is not totally revolutionary. It's still groupism, just jumping from one group to another. So think about, could we ever achieve a world that's free of group identities, or at least free of these identities that categorize people as dominant or subordinate? And what would that be like?